All right, folks. Mr. Hansen here. I want to show you guys how to set up and import your CAD model for your Dragster or your CO2 powered Dragster into the software called SimScale. We're going to use SimScale to calculate some of the aerodynamic properties of your design. And so I'm essentially going to be applying a tutorial that is on SimScale. You can find the link in the assignment here. It's a fantastic tutorial. I'm going to show you how to use this for your CO2 Dragster body. Now, you should have CO2 Dragster model. You should have at least 3 is what we're looking for comparison purposes. And so here's our stock body. Nothing too fancy. I'm going to run a simulation with that. If you got something more complicated, we decided that it really only made sense to simulate the body. And if we can compare the different bodies, the wheel and axle setup should be the same between them. So if you have put together like a part studio or assembly with axles and wheels, that's fine. But we're going to make sure we're just selecting the part that represents the body that's going to have the aerodynamic characteristics that we want. So importing this into SimScale is actually going to be relatively simple. Let's just kind of start fresh from the top. Let's create a new project. Let's call this Dragster demo. You call it something better for your particular design. Let's see, this is probably automotive. All right, let's create a SimScale project. All right, so the first thing you're going to need to do is import a geometry. And so a geometry is just the geometric part that you've created in your CAD software. SimScale interfaces with Onshape pretty nicely, so it's actually relatively easy to do. So let me find my CO2 Dragster part studio. I think design 1 was my stock body. I'm going to select that stock body part. So if you have more than one parts, like if you got your wheels and axles, select the part that represents the body. And if you've named your parts in that part studio, is going to make it easy to do that. So do keep up with naming stuff. All right, I'm going to run that import, and it's going to import that 3D file directly. May take a second because it's moving some data from Onshape. There we go. Geometry successfully imported. Whoop-de-doo. All right. Now, you can repeat that process and go ahead and load up all 3 bodies that you want to simulate right here. So we can have design 1, design 2, design 3, and it'll be really quick and easy to run the simulations once we have that simulation set up. So what we're going to do with this stock body is going to be a little bit interesting. What we're going to need to actually simulate this is an enclosure, which is essentially the wind tunnel that we're testing this thing in. And so before we create a simulation, click the little menu by stock body, and we're going to add a geometry operation, and we're going to create an enclosure around this car. So that's going to be our wind tunnel. And so keep in mind how you size this thing is going to kind of depend on how your car is oriented. And so I've, my front to back, maybe a little bit backwards, my top's top, my left and right. But you'll see down here on this little view cube, there's the X, Y, and Z axes. And so I'm gonna set up some values that's gonna sort of shrink this down. I don't want this enclosure to be too big, because if this enclosure is too big, it's going to take more time to simulate, and it's not really going to help my simulation. So I believe the specs I'm using, let's do 0.5. Let's make our minimum, because I got this centered in the middle. So let's make that minus 0.5. Let's set my X maximum to 1 meter. Oh, you know what? I want that to be backwards. Let's set my X minimum to -1 meter. Let's set my X maximum to to 0.5. Let's work on my y-axis, which is going to be in either direction. And I'm actually going to skip one of the complicated steps done in the tutorial just to make this a little easier to explain. But let's make that 0.2. Oops, sorry. Minimum's got to be minus 0.2, 0.2. That'll give me good characteristics around the side, and I won't need quite as much vertical distance. So the bottom of this car is on the bottom, so I'm going to leave that to be 0 minimum on the z-axis. And let me set this to be 0.1 is probably too small. Let me do 0.2. All right, and so that's going to calculate an enclosure around this car. And it's going to have to do some calculations around the body of your CO2 racer. So we don't need to select any face here. So I'm, click start, and that's going to maybe take a minute or two to actually run. All right, so these types of operations, and you'll encounter this a couple times while running your simulation, requires a little bit of work on the computers, the servers in the background. I mean, all the software is cloud-based, so all these calculations are running on SimScale's servers, but they are very computationally intensive. So that ran pretty quick, so that wasn't so bad. But generating meshes and doing simulations may be a little more time intensive. And so now we got a big fancy old block surrounding our car. So let me close that enclosure. We got to do one more thing before we actually start setting up our simulation. So I'm going to select one of these faces by clicking. I'm going to right click that, and I'm going to hide flow region. Is that what I wanted? That's not what I want. Let me show all. Let me hide selection. There we go. And what I essentially need, and let me hide the rest of these faces. Just click all of them. I'm trying to get the faces of the car because I'm going to actually need to save those surfaces here so that I can use that in my simulation. So let me hide those things. Let's see if it'll just. All right. Cool. So I'm going up here. Let me show you how I did that. I'm going to go up here to select faces, and I'm going to wonder if that'll let me select the volume. No, that'll grab the box. I don't want the box. Go to select faces. We need to select all of the faces of this vehicle. We do want to make sure we're selecting the interior faces of the CO2 canister if you've got that. I'm gonna, yeah, let's go ahead and get the inside of the axles. Making sure we're selecting all the surfaces, what are called faces of your vehicle. And depending on how complicated your design is, you may have some clicking to do. You might be able to drag and select to do that. But what we're going to create is a topological entity set, which is really just going to be all these surfaces. We're going to use that in our simulation. So let me call that up. Let's see, this is design one stock body. Call this design one body. And so now I've just got all those surfaces saved, and that just lets me click over here and select all those guys, which is going to be super useful when I'm running my simulation. All right, so if you got that set up, I go ahead and do the same thing with your other two designs, have them all imported, have them all collected in a entity, and then you'll be ready to actually start setting up and running some simulations.